Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. Who were some of Christendom's finest thinkers? That's what I'll be asking my next guest in this episode. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up apologetics clubs on high school, community college, and university campuses throughout the world. However, we're not just reaching students. Through Ratio Christi Professor, or RC Prof, we're connecting with professors who are confessors. These are Christian professors throughout the United States and the world who, as Christians, talk about how being a Christian influences their vocation, not only as a professor in general, but also in a specific field they have a PhD in. Also, when we get your child or grandchild in a Ratio Christi Club, high school through college and university, then we get them for 8 years. Sometimes if they're just joining when they get into college, we have them for 4 years. But when we connect with the professor, we get the classroom for 30 years. Because that professor can then disciple children and grandchildren, your child or grandchild, on their very own school campus. Just go to ratiochristi.org and click on RC Prof to find out more about that. The purpose of Ratio Christi is to help make people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview and to point people to truth with a capital T, which is what we call our program, Truth Matters. Joining me is philosopher and theologian Kenneth Richard Samples. He has a great passion to help people understand the reasonableness and relevance of Christianity's truth claims. He is the senior research scholar at Reasons to Believe and the author of several books, including Christian Endgame, Careful Thinking About the End Times, and also 7 Truths That Change the World, Discovering Christianity's Most Dangerous Ideas. He has been here a number of times. It's always a blessing to have him here. Ken, welcome back to Truth Matters.
Hi, Tony. It's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate your work, and I always look forward to interacting with you.
Thank you so much. It's a blessing to have you here for a topic that a lot of Christians have not studied. They don't, some have. We know that you have. We have a lot of Christians who haven't studied church history. We have those who love church history. I mean, they have volumes upon volumes of church history that fills the gaps of what has happened between the book of Acts and where we are today. In church history, outside of Scripture, who do you consider to be the 2 most important Christian thinkers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and why?
Yeah, that's a very important topic, and I completely agree with you, Tony, that lots of evangelical Christians, they know who the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul were, and James and Peter, but after that, they don't know a lot about Christian history, and it's important to know about Christian history because it is a time in which the Christian faith spreads throughout the world. I want to talk about 2 people here in the 2nd and 3rd century, and both of them are important, Tony, largely for what they critique and what they defend. Remember that by the 2nd and 3rd century, Christianity is spreading through the western and eastern parts of the world, and Christian doctrine is being discussed and dialogued with, and the Christian religion, the Christian faith, is encountering people of other points of view. So the first person I want to mention in the 2nd century is a church father named Irenaeus. Irenaeus is pretty close to the apostles. When he's a young man, he studies under Polycarp, and Polycarp knew the apostle John. So he's just 1 generation removed from the last apostle, which was John. Irenaeus is really a very important figure. He is both a theologian and an apologist, and he is the first one to encounter a major heresy that hits and impacts with the church called Gnosticism. Gnosticism is characterized by a number of beliefs, by the idea that there is an unknowable God who is above Jehovah. Jehovah created the world, but there's a greater God, and that greater God cannot be known. It also is characterized by the idea that matter is evil and spirit is good. And so there is a real dualism taking place there. It's even the belief that Jesus didn't have a body, and creation is obviously very suspect. Well, Irenaeus takes on Gnosticism. He tackles their beliefs. He learns their sources and their arguments. And in his writing, he responds to them. And the reason I mention this being very important is Gnosticism is not only one of the most powerful, one of the most dangerous and influential heresies, but it continues to exist even today. I'm thinking now of the Da Vinci Code. Dan Brown's book has a Gnostic flavor. And Christian scholars are often dealing with Gnostic writings, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas. So Irenaeus really gives us a lot of information about ancient Gnosticism. He also tells us who wrote the Gospels, because he is differentiating between the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with these Gnostic Gospels, which are counter to historic Christianity. The other person that is also very, very important, and every Christian should know him, his name is Athanasius. Athanasius is an Egyptian man who comes from a Christian family, and Athanasius is the secretary and the deacon to the Bishop of Alexandria. And in fact, Athanasius goes with Bishop Alexander to the most important Christian council in the history of the faith. That's the Council of Nicaea. And at the Council of Nicaea, there is a Christology, a theological doctrine of the person of Christ, set forth by a very influential thinker called Irenaeus of Alexandria. And Irenaeus says that Jesus, he has a nature that is like God, but not fully God. He is the highest created creature. And so this is a denial of the deity of Jesus Christ. This makes Jesus a creature. Athanasius is one of the most important church fathers. In fact, I think he may be the most honored early Christian outside the New Testament now. He is respected by the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic traditions and by the Protestant tradition. And the reason is Athanasius battled the heresy of Arianism. And some have said that without Athanasius's persistence, without his ability to outthink, outwit, and outlast the Arians, that the church may have adopted a Christology that is a lot like the Jehovah's Witnesses who knock at your door. So, Tony, these first two people, Irenaeus and Athanasius, are so important for defending a Christian view of God, the Trinity, the deity of Christ, and for critiquing heresies like Gnosticism and Arianism.
Ken, it's amazing to think about the amount of manuscript evidence that lets us know that the Bible is reliable, that it has not been changed. More manuscript evidence for the Bible than any other book from antiquity. But in addition to that, we as Christians today are standing upon the shoulders of giants. Every book that we have in the New Testament is written down before the year 100, the first century. The people you just talked about, second and third century. So who do you consider to be the two most important thinkers in the 4th and 5th centuries, and why?
Yes. Now we come on two thinkers that I think are amazingly influential. Every Christian ought to know about them. The first one is a person named Jerome. Jerome is born about 347. Jerome is a contemporary with the second individual I want to talk about, Augustine of Hippo, or we call him Saint Augustine. Jerome plays an extraordinary role, Tony. Jerome is known as the greatest biblical scholar in the ancient world. He knows Latin inside and out, but he's not going to settle for just reading the Bible in Latin. He insists on reading the Bible and studying and translating it from its original languages. So the Old Testament is written primarily in Hebrew. The New Testament is written in Greek. The translations at that time the church was moving in a direction in the Roman Empire of reading from the Latin translation. So Jerome, an incredibly talented biblical scholar, translates the Bible into Latin, and it's called the Vulgate. The Vulgate becomes the most important translation of the Bible in Latin in history. And so here you have this amazing scholar who is just tenacious. And there's a quote from Jerome that I love. He says, "Ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ." And so here is a great church father, a monastic father, out in the desert, translating Scripture and presenting a copy of Scripture that would have deep influence on Western Christianity. The other individual, Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine, dates 354 to 430. Tony, I would argue, and more important than just my own assessment, I think there's a virtual consensus that St. Augustine may be the most influential Christian outside of the Bible. His influence is really enormous. Catholics, of course, honor him deeply, but so do Protestants. I'll give you an example of that. John Calvin, the great biblical scholar of the Reformation era, Calvin quotes Thomas Aquinas 100 times approximately, another 100 times from Martin Luther. He quotes Augustine 4,200 times. And again, the idea as a Protestant, he wanted to make the case that the best in Catholic scholarship, in his mind, Augustine was on his side on many important ideas. Augustine is known for many things, battling the Pelagian heresy. Pelagius was a British monk who said people are born good. Sin is not so much part of our nature. Sin is just a matter of having bad habits and bad role modeling, and you could be saved without the grace of God intervening in your life. Well, Augustine responded and said, we possess a sinful nature that we have received, passed on from Adam. Augustine battled many other heretical perspectives, but I would say maybe his most influential areas in the books that he wrote, his book, The Confessions, Tony, is it really begins the whole genre of literature called the autobiography. And this book talks about his extraordinary life, his great conversion. Confessions really is understood in the triple sense. It is his confession of faith, but also his confession of his own sinfulness and a confession to the glory of God. There was a study done a number of years ago by evangelical scholars, and outside of Scripture, Augustine's Confession was voted the most influential Christian book in history. He also wrote other books, The City of God, which is an extraordinary critique of the Greco-Roman philosophy and a presentation of the history of the Christian faith, a philosophy of history, if you will. And he also wrote an extraordinary book on the Trinity called On the Trinity. So here you have two church fathers living near the end of that era we call the patristic era, or the era of the church fathers. Jerome is the great translator. St. Augustine is the great Christian thinker, apologist, and they were individuals every Christian should know something about.
And as we look to the book of Acts as being the beginning of church history and making our way through the century, chronologically closer to our time, who do you consider to be the two most important thinkers in the Middle Ages, and why?
Yes, I would say that, the Middle Ages is roughly from about 500 AD to about 1500. So the Reformation starts in 1517, and so it is that 1,000-year period after the Greco-Roman period, but before the Renaissance and Reformation eras. I think that Christianity is just loaded with great Christian thinkers in that period as well. But if I had to pick two, I would pick Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas. In the Catholic tradition, St. Anselm and St. Thomas. Uh, Anselm was a remarkable philosopher. He really founded a school called the Scholastic School. And Tony, I know that you have a real passion for apologetics. You work with Ratio Christi. You do your program here. Anselm was a person who said, "Look, faith is a gift of divine revelation, but once a Christian has faith, they can use their reason and rationality to discover the underlying reasons for what they believe." And so Anselm is an individual who argues that Christian truth is not just something that's given from reading scripture, but that there is a rationale, there is a reasoning behind it. Anselm developed a number of ideas that are very critical, but I'll tell you a brief story. He's meditating on Psalm 14 because, after all, he's a monk. He's meditating on Psalm 14. He reads verse 1 of the chapter, which says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." And out of reading that and meditating on it, Anselm came up with one of the most influential, also controversial arguments for God, called the ontological argument. And that argument essentially says that God is a maximally perfect being, and because he is a being than which none greater can be conceived, he must exist. Now, again, this argument is still talked about today. There are still people that it kind of rattles the cage. But what's interesting is that even though some people have been critical of it, like Immanuel Kant, other people like René Descartes, and even to our own day, Alvin Plantinga, one of the most distinguished Christians, philosophers living today, has a version of Anselm's ontological argument. And it all came out of a prayerful reflection. Well, the other philosopher of that era, Thomas Aquinas, may be the most influential Christian philosopher in Christian history. Thomas was a Dominican father. He developed what he called the 5 ways. These are 5 arguments for God's existence, looking at motion, looking at cause and effect, looking at contingency, perfection. Thomas also developed 2 extraordinary books in his time. So we're looking at the 1200s, we're looking at the 13th century. Aristotle's philosophy, the great Greek thinker, his ideas and manuscripts were rediscovered during that period. And some of the Muslim scholars took Aristotle and used it to synthesize an Islamic philosophy, arguing that the Western world ought to embrace Islam. Well, Thomas Aquinas wrote 2 extraordinary books, Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologica. Both of these books are a critique of that Greek, Arab, Islamic synthesis. And so Thomas takes Aristotle's philosophy. He takes what he thinks is consistent with Christianity. He rejects parts that he thinks are incompatible with it. But I have to tell you this, Tony, I'm not sure that there has ever been a Christian thinker that was willing to consider virtually every argument against his position. I mean, when you read through Summa Theologica, and it is not an easy read, it's 2 million words long, but you have what I think, you may have the smartest Christian who ever lived. Now, both Anselm and Aquinas, of course, are connected to the Roman Catholic tradition, but there are many Protestants who have found their work absolutely extraordinary and presenting a defense of Christian theism.
Another very interesting and humorous part about Thomas Aquinas' works, as you know, Ken, is he not only gives great ways of explaining stuff, but he will actually take a rebuttal and then he will actually explain it better than you can even explain it yourself, and then he'll destroy it. So Thomas Aquinas
Yeah.
is a great person to read, and it's just amazing work. And I'm just working my way through Summa Contra Gentili still. I'm not even through it yet, but yes, I am definitely enjoying that, and I want to encourage our viewers to look at that as well. And you said that the Middle Ages, okay, this is like 500s to 1500s, so now we're like less than 600 years away from now. So, who do you consider to be the two most important thinkers of the Reformation era, and why?
Yeah, now this is a very important era. This is, of course, the birth of Protestantism. Prior to the 1500s, there is Christendom, and Christendom is divided. 1056, you have the division between the Eastern and Western churches. So you have the Eastern Orthodox tradition, you have the Roman Catholic tradition. The two thinkers I'm, of course, immediately thinking of are Martin Luther and John Calvin. Luther is an Augustinian monk. He has a lot of angst, a lot of concern. He is living at a time, I think, where even Roman Catholics would admit the church, in some respects, had kind of lost its way. They were selling indulgences to collect money for the rebuilding of St. Peter's. And Luther, as a monk, felt that this was kind of merchandising on things that are very sacred. Well, you know, Luther was a very sensitive soul. He confessed his sins. In fact, there are stories that he might spend 4 or 5 hours in confession. And he followed the rules of penance, but he never felt secure with God. He never felt that he really knew that God had loved him and God had forgiven him and he could be secure. And it is out of Luther's study of Scripture, particularly the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, where Luther has his extraordinary transformation, where he uncovers what Protestants call the doctrine of justification by faith, that we're not saved by grace, faith, and our own good works, but we are justified, we're acquitted by the grace of God that is in the person of Jesus Christ. And we have been acquitted, we have been forgiven solely through faith. And so the doctrine of justification by faith, Luther's view that Scripture is the supreme authority, tradition has value, church councils have value, but Scripture is the supreme authority. So what we call sola fide, faith alone, sola scriptura, Scripture alone, sola gratia, grace alone. Luther, in various ways, founds a whole new branch of Christendom called Protestantism. And I don't know that there's ever been an inspirational leader like Luther. Luther was also an extraordinary author, 55 volumes in his works. The other individual that I would want to talk about is John Calvin. Calvin is an extraordinary scholar. He is, I think he's misunderstood in many ways, as often many Christians are. But, you know, Calvin is not a philosopher. Calvin is not somebody who spends a lot of time kind of speculating. He's a biblical scholar. He translates, he writes commentaries on almost every book of the Old Testament, virtually every book in the New Testament. If Luther is the great inspirational leader of the Reformation, I would say that Calvin may be its greatest systematic theologian. And where Luther's books, his two books that look at the Catechism become very, very important. Calvin's book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Tony, there are plenty of historians who would say that it's difficult to conceive of the founding of America without the Protestant Reformation, without the Reformed theological tradition, and Calvin's book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. So here you have two extraordinary scholars that birth and develop a whole Protestant tradition. And of course, there are many people who come through that tradition and develop it in a variety of ways. But I think that the two greatest and most influential Christian thinkers of the period of the Reformation would be Luther and Calvin.
Now, Ken, we only have about a minute and a half left, but if you can answer this next question, we will actually have a 28-minute summary of 2,000 years of the most important thinkers in church history. How about the last few centuries? Who would you consider important and why?
Yeah, let me be brief here. I would tell you there's a thinker in the 17th century named Blaise Pascal. Pascal is a mathematical genius. He develops a calculating machine in the 1600s that many people have said is the first step in the development toward the computer. Pascal has a great conversion to Christianity and develops his writing called the Pensées. I think Pascal is an extraordinary Christian thinker who helps us to think very carefully about the human condition and the incredible importance of knowing Jesus and knowing about his life, death, and resurrection. The other individual that I would mention is C.S. Lewis. I think Lewis is the most important Christian apologist of the 20th century. Many people listening to my voice and seeing my face here know him through his children's writings, the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis wrote many apologetic books. Tony, the first Christian book I ever read was Mere Christianity. Had a powerful influence on me. I've never gotten away from Lewis. It's not to say that I don't disagree with him from time to time like I do all the people that I've mentioned. But Lewis has had an extraordinary influence. And I would say, I think his books have just had such a powerful influence. That same list where I mentioned St. Augustine's book Confessions as being the most influential, number 2 was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. So don't miss Pascal and Lewis if you want to know about some great Christian thinkers.
Excellent. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the 22nd century, people are looking back to philosopher Ken Samples as someone who was a very influential thinker. And of course, Ken's books are great. I would suggest that you get both of them, not just the 7 Truths That Changed the World, as I mentioned earlier, but also Christian Endgame, as well as his other books I haven't even mentioned in this show. Just go to Amazon and you'll be able to find a bunch. Ken, it's always a blessing to have you here. Thank you so much for this 28-minute summary of 2,000 years of the church's most finest thinkers.
Thank you, Tony. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, friends. When we look at the available evidence, we find that the Christian worldview aligns with reality. Church history is very important. Please check it out. Look to these thinkers, these great thinkers who Ken has pointed us to. And remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.